This is Continental Briefing. Folks, we need to talk about something truly disturbing unfolding right now in Louisiana politics that should send chills down the spine of anyone who cares about fair elections and democratic norms. A Republican governor has just dropped what amounts to one of the most brazen power plays I've witnessed in recent memory from any state executive. Picture this: an official proclamation complete with ornate state seal and dramatic calligraphy, boldly titled in all capital letters as a state of emergency. At first glance, you might assume it's responding to a devastating hurricane tearing through the Gulf Coast, or perhaps some widespread civil unrest threatening public safety, or even a major public health crisis leaving families without basic support. But no, none of that. Instead, this declaration is explicitly aimed at suspending the ongoing party primary elections for seats in the United States Congress across the state. In straightforward terms, the governor of Louisiana has used his authority to hit the pause button on voting that's already underway for these critical federal races. Supporters will frame it as a necessary step tied to ongoing redistricting battles and a recent court directive from the Supreme Court. But let's be real. If you buy that this is purely about legal compliance and nothing more, you're missing the bigger picture entirely. We've seen warnings for months about how certain political forces might test the waters for declaring emergencies to disrupt or override election processes when things aren't going their way. Ideas floated at the national level around November voting, involving everything from federal interventions to ballot handling. People dismissed those concerns as overblown or alarmist, yet here we are, watching it play out in real time during these Louisiana primaries. The rules of the game were set, ballots started going out, and suddenly the side that doesn't like the current setup decides it's time to rewrite the script with executive fiat. A single signature, and poof, voting stops mid-process. If you've already mailed in your ballot, tough luck. It's as if it never happened, and make no mistake, this isn't going unchallenged. Legal teams, including prominent voting rights advocates and their firms, have already jumped into action with lawsuits filed in both state and federal courts to block this move and restore the process. The message is clear. We cannot sit idly by while elected officials claim that whenever election and outcomes look unfavorable, they can simply declare an emergency and shut it all down. This sets a dangerous precedent that goes far beyond one state's congressional map disputes. It raises urgent questions about the integrity of our entire electoral system if leaders start treating voting as optional based on their political convenience. Let's dig deeper into why this feels so off base. The governor could have pursued a more measured path, waiting for the full court mandate to filter down, requesting an injunction through proper channels, or even calling a swift special legislative session to address the redistricting fallout. But instead, the choice was made to go for the dramatic flair of a formal emergency decree, complete with that eye-catching all-caps language, halting elections. It has the unmistakable air of a signal to certain political bases, a bold assertion of unilateral strength rather than collaborative governance. Imagine for a moment the reverse scenario playing out under different leadership. Would we see similar tolerance if a Democratic governor in another state tried something comparable after an unfavorable ruling on, say, major policy like healthcare reforms? History suggests the outcry would be swift and unrelenting, with accusations of overreach flying from every corner. Yet here, in this climate, it slides through with justifications tied to court orders that could have been handled through standard procedures. This isn't just about redistricting technicalities. It's intertwined with deeper fights over representation. The underlying issue stems from maps that many argue dilute the voting power of minority communities, particularly black voters in Louisiana, seeking fairer congressional districts reflective of the state's demographics. By invoking emergency powers to pause the primary, the action effectively sidelines those voices at a pivotal moment, all while claiming it's about compliance rather than control. And the timing couldn't be more revealing. Early voting and mail-in ballots were already in motion, including for military personnel and Americans living abroad. Think about a service member stationed overseas, perhaps aboard a vessel in the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean, who took the time to request and cast their ballot under the rules as they stood. Now, those votes risk being tossed aside entirely, forcing a do-over that might not even be feasible given deployment schedules and logistics. For a party that often positions itself as the strongest defender of our troops, this move carries a heavy layer of irony and hypocrisy, disenfranchising the very people it claims to prioritize. The fallout extends beyond just these congressional races, too. Other primaries on the ballot for that day are proceeding as planned, meaning the state is essentially engineering a fragmented election calendar purely to force through new maps that favor certain outcomes. It's a calculated effort to redraw boundaries in ways that could minimize minority representation and solidify majorities, all under the guise of responding to judicial pressure. But as critics point out, this isn't how democracy is supposed to function. Elections shouldn't be canceled on a whim when the playing field starts to shift unfavorably. What makes this particularly alarming is the broader context of national politics. With ongoing debates about governance, policy priorities, and public sentiment, there's a growing sense that some factions recognize they may struggle to win on merits alone, whether it's economic pressures, international conflicts, healthcare access, or rising costs affecting everyday families. Instead of engaging voters directly, the strategy appears to lean toward entrenching power through procedural maneuvers and structural advantages. We've seen echoes of this in past redistricting battles across states like Alabama and Texas, where courts have grappled with similar timing issues. Yet the inconsistency stands out sharply when you recall the so-called Purcell Doctrine, that legal principle warning against last-minute changes to election rules because they could create chaos and confusion for voters. In case after case, we've watched this doctrine invoked to delay or block reforms to allegedly unfair maps when those changes were deemed too close to Election Day, often months in advance, like in January or even earlier in the cycle. Victories for voting rights groups in Louisiana back in 2020 or parallel wins in Alabama around the same time frame were sidelined precisely because judges cited the risk of disruption. Now, with primaries actively underway and ballots already cast, the same courts face a test. Will they apply that same logic when the disruption serves one side's interests, or will precedent bend? It's not hypothetical. It's the exact scenario unfolding, and it demands intense scrutiny. If judges who once ruled that alterations 11 months out were too risky suddenly find flexibility here, it exposes a troubling double standard that erodes public faith in impartial justice, the aesthetic of strength projected by this proclamation. Formal document, bold language, immediate halt to voting feels deliberately provocative. It normalizes the idea that in moments of political inconvenience, leaders can bypass legislatures, courts, and voters alike by invoking extraordinary powers. If this were happening in another nation, observers might label it the hallmark of a weakening democracy, where executive overreach supplants the will of the people. Here at home, it risks desensitizing us to those same tactics, planting seeds for future escalations where emergencies become a convenient tool for reshaping outcomes rather than addressing genuine crises. The intent seems clear. Signal to supporters that when elections don't align with expectations, don't fret about Congress, state houses, or judicial checks. Just act decisively and unilaterally. Of course, the legal pushback is crucial and ongoing. Multiple suits are already advancing through state and federal channels, arguing that this suspension violates core voting protections and creates unnecessary chaos precisely of the kind courts have long sought to avoid. Advocates are pressing hard for consistency, demanding that the rule of law apply evenly, regardless of which party stands to gain or lose. We've seen it before. When the shoe is on the other foot, hypothetical reversals, like a governor in a blue state attempting to zero out opposition districts mid-process, would likely trigger immediate federal intervention and widespread condemnation. The expectation must be the same here. Equal standards, equal scrutiny, no exceptions based on partisan alignment. This moment tests not just Louisiana's system, but the resilience of our national commitment to democratic processes. It highlights how easily norms can fray when power feels threatened and why vigilant oversight from courts, legal warriors, and informed citizens remains essential. As we monitor the coming rulings, it's worth reflecting on the human cost. Everyday voters, service members far from home, and communities fighting for equitable voice, all caught in the crosshairs of this high-stakes maneuvering. In the end, this Louisiana emergency declaration isn't merely a procedural footnote. It's a stark reminder that the defense of democracy demands constant vigilance against those who would bend its rules to preserve their advantage. What does it say about our future if we allow such tactics to become routine? And where might they lead when the stakes rise even higher this fall? The answer lies in how we respond today and every election cycle ahead.